So hi, everybody. Welcome to the first of our mini lesson videos and the second video that I put on the Moodle site. What I'd like to do is just review and elaborate a little bit on some of the points that I made in the introductory video, giving you some thoughts about these ideas of metaphysics and epistemology and axiology, and how they relate, since those ideas are a significant part of our reading in the George Knight book this week. And I'd also want to just take a couple of minutes, maybe even less. I hope I don't yammer on too much, just to talk a little bit about the paper and give you some additional background and some thoughts about that. So let's talk about those major ideas of metaphysics and epistemology and axiology that Knight talks about, particularly in that second chapter that I'm having you skim, which is probably enough, but there are some interesting details and some potential ways of looking at these three ideas that I hope will be helpful. So the first idea is this notion of metaphysics, and metaphysics has to do with reality. And as Knight talks about it, there are different ways of studying reality and different kinds of disciplines that you're probably familiar with that have to do with looking at reality. The first of those is cosmology, which really has to do with the universe. Like, how did all this stuff come to be? That's the big philosophical question. And of course, theoretical physicists and quantum physicists, who are also theoretical, have ideas about how the universe came to be. The idea of the Big Bang is one of those postulates, right? The idea that the universe was generated from a single massive explosion of a tiny particle that just blew up. And what we've come to know is that there's some credibility to that, in that we've been able to, for example, discover background noise that came from the Big Bang out many, many, many billions of light years away. So that gives us some indication that the Big Bang may indeed have actually taken place, but there are still a lot of things that we don't know about the universe and how it's constructed, and where the matter comes from and goes, and gravity and how it all sticks together. So cosmology is really looking at those sorts of questions, those big issues that have to do with the universe. Then there's theology, and that's really the study of the divine, or the study of God. And who is God? Is there a God? Is the God a prime mover? Is God involved in what we do on a day-to-day basis? Does God intervene in our lives somehow? That also has to do with reality, because how we look at God and how we think about how God is in our lives gives us individually some sense of what reality is all about and what kind of meaning we can draw from what reality is. There's anthropology, which is really the study of people and cultures. So really looking at metaphysics at the level of who we are and our relationships, and what that tells us about what reality really is. That's another way to look at and think about that notion of metaphysics. And finally, there's this idea of ontology, right? And ontology really is about the reality, in the sense of, is what we know material or spiritual, or is it material and spiritual? So what are the dimensions of what we're actually experiencing right now? So these are all the different frames that metaphysics uses to talk about what reality is and what is real. So another way to look at it, and there's obviously the objective reality of the, of the table or of the computer or of my head? Is it rock, or is it wood, or is it something else? And those are important things to know too when it comes to conceiving what reality is. There's also the reality that comes from cause and effect. So scientific experiments provide some sense of what's real. From this perspective, for example, ibuprofen has been tested, cause and effect. It is a cause, and it creates these kinds of effects. It's an analgesic, and it helps alleviate pain. There are some side effects, but we know the kind of cause and effect, and we can see that directly. And we know that or we think we know that that's a reality, that cause and effect in that scientific or medical experiment. But there are also other kinds of experiments that are interesting that test our notion of reality. For example, about 20 years ago, there was an experiment with prayer groups in the United States who prayed for peace in the Middle East. And as they were praying, there were observers on the ground in the Middle East looking at the levels of violence that were taking place. And there was some correspondence or some correlation between the prayer groups on the one hand, that cause, and the effect of a mitigation or a lessening of violence on the other. Now, there, the relationship is a little bit more tenuous, but for some of us who might believe that there are some other forces at work, and some forces at work that we can't see and that we can exercise, or that some effect on reality, or that there are some changes that we can see in reality, would say that that's real and that effect is real. So those are some of the ways that we look at this idea of metaphysics. And keep that idea, that notion of reality in mind, because on page 9, Knight talks about that as being one of the core understandings that we're looking at and we're after when it comes to metaphysics. He also talks about the notion of truth. And truth really is in that frame of epistemology, how we come to know things. How do we know what's real and what's true? Is our knowing reality objective or subjective? Do we know reality through our senses only? So only what I see and hear and touch and taste and feel, that's what I know as real? Do I know reality through revelation? Have I believed something? Has something been revealed to me in the Bible or in the Quran about what reality is? And do I live by that precept as a result? So revelation might be important. Is reality based on intuition? So do I intuit things? Do I kind of feel things and feel that things are right in some way? Do I learn and know things by authority? So, I look to a teacher, I look to a political figure, I look to some other type of authority that tells me this is what I should know, this is what I should do. So yes, that's truth, and I know that. And that's a particular type of epistemology. Is it based on reason? Can I logically think that, like cause and effect, because there's a cause, then there's a direct effect, or there's a correlation between two things happening? And does that reasoning give me some understanding of how I know and what knowledge really is about? So those are different aspects of epistemology that are important. And of course, for us as educators, knowing how we know tells us in some ways how we learn and how we learn best. So also how we should teach. So epistemology is really an important focus for us as educators and as people who think about teaching, because that gives us a purchase and an understanding on about yeah, what do we need to do? Is it authority? Is it reason? Is it sensing? Is it intuition? Is it all of those or some of those that we need to apply in order to get students to learn? So that's the truth piece. So we've talked about reality, we've talked about truth, and axiology is value. There are two parts to axiology. One is ethics, how we behave, and the other is aesthetics, which is basically what's beautiful and how do we know what's beautiful? How do we give that value? How do we put value on this as beautiful as opposed to that as beautiful? The value is also important ethically, as I said, because we want behaviors to also reflect what we value as important. So what is there good in doing good for others, or should we do good for ourselves? And should we do good for others first, or should we do good for ourselves first? That's one of those value questions, axiological questions, that we might want to ask, and we might want to have our students to wrestle with. So, what do we value? What's important? Be careful to distinguish between those basic assumptions about reality, truth, and value. Make a distinction between those and our approaches, our techniques, our strategies in education. So, we're not talking about the value of a discussion group or the value of having hands-on learning. We're going deeper than that and really looking at where does value come from? Why do we as individuals and as educators value this, the common good, over individualism and individual liberty? Why is one better or more important or more valuable than the other? So those are those essential kinds of ethical questions that Knight is asking us to deal with and asking us to think about. So use those frames: reality, what's reality, truth, what's truth, and value, what has value, to think about all of the different kinds of philosophies and ideas that we're going to be dealing with for the rest of the semester. All three of these are related in some way, obviously, because how we know things also influences what we value. How we know things also influences what we think reality is. And it helps us explain reality. So keep that in mind as well. See, as you're writing, as you're thinking, and as you're responding to discussion boards, if you can sort of metacognitively think about, is this an epistemological question? Is this an axiological question? Is it a metaphysical question? So in the first discussion, for example, that thought experiment with Miep has a lot to do with how we think, with our epistemology, and how Miep is taught. So be aware of that and be thinking of that for yourself as you're responding to the different discussions that we engage with over the course of this semester, over the next 7 weeks. I think the discussions have been really good so far. I think we can even go deeper. I think you really want, when you make a claim in your discussion, ask yourself why. Why are you making that claim? What else can you say about it? And what other questions can you add to the discussion that's going to encourage your colleagues to think a little bit more deeply and respond to you? So leaving a question might be a good way to end your discussions so that you're encouraging some conversation down the road. Last of all, I want to talk about the paper. Now, there are two parts to the paper. The first part has us look at that allegory of the cave that is sort of fundamental in the history of philosophy, since it was provided by Plato, a student of Socrates, as an explanation for how we know reality and what we know of reality, how we come to know what's there and what's in the world. So the first part of your paper will, that first third that I'm asking you to consider is I'm asking you to explain the allegory of the cave. So read it, look at the graphic. What does Plato want us to think all the parts of that allegory mean to what he believes the world is like? So how does that allegory tell us what Plato believed of how we got to know what the world was? And talk about that. How do you kind of sort that through? What's the point of that allegory? Second thing is your philosophy of education. And I think one of the key questions that I ask in that particular assignment is, what are your assumptions about education? What's real? Is reality objective, or is it subjective, or is it a blend? So what is it metaphysically? What are your assumptions about how people come to know? Does everybody come in with an automatic understanding of what the world is and how the universe is and what our place is, and we just discover that as we go along? Is it that discovery? Or do we come in, as I said in my introductory video, as blank slates? And do we really piece reality together, sensory experience by sensory experience? And is that how we learn? Is that our assumption of how we think about and know the world? So epistemologically, is that what we're about? Or do we use reason and reason alone? What do we do with things like intuition? What's your assumption about intuition and how it works? And does it have a value? And do you want to bring it out in your students? And finally, what's valuable? So do you believe that that experience is the most valuable thing? Do you believe that creating good citizens has value, or the common good has value? Do you believe that instilling agency in students has value? So again, it's not how you do those things, but are those things important? So in the second 2/3 of the paper, focus on those ideas. What are your assumptions? What do you assume about reality, truth, and value when it comes to talking about education? I think that's it. I don't think I have any more. You're probably lucky. Thanks for watching this long. If you've gotten to the end. And in the meantime, I'll let you know that I'll, pop myself in here, pop myself into the discussions, as well as on these videos. I appreciate your attention. Thank you. And keep up the good work. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.